This month at Hadash and at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, which I also helped to direct, we've run social media posts for Pride Month. We advertised this Shabbat. We connected to essays written in the 1990s, even talking about the importance of equal treatment of same-sex partnerships. We put out what we thought were not particularly controversial statements. We got a lot of positive responses, people saying thank you and happy Pride and celebrating the fact that we did so. We got a lot more negative responses than I would have expected. Maybe that was naive of me. But after all, we are boosting and promoting these posts to a wider audience, not simply talking to ourselves. And so people will see them. And I would like to think that people with a negative thought would simply scroll by and not post something mean. But sometimes they do. Sometimes it's just their response. They make an angry face or a laughing face instead of a thumbs up or a heart. And just this past week, one person commented, "Where in the Torah does it allow same-sex partnerships?" I said to him, well, lucky for us that the Torah is the beginning but not the end of the Jewish values conversation. And so we might like love the stranger, love your neighbor, but we don't have to follow the acceptance of slavery or the requirement to not plow a field with two animals that are different from each other. Who cares? The reality is that we get to choose from that past what speaks and is relevant to us. And we've evolved in many ways from that past. We are not captive to the values of our ancestors. I thought about Pride Month in 2023 and how naive I was to think that I wouldn't get negative commentary. And I also thought, I wonder how much this is life for people who are out and proud and advocates for LGBT rights every month of the year as a prominent part of who they are, of the work they're doing in the world. How much of this must they get every day, every month? In some ways, this is the best of times and the worst of times for LGBT rights. You get your thumbs up and you get your angry faces. I want to share with you some numbers that I think dramatize how this is both the best and the worst of times. The first numbers, they're a pair, 61 and 258. This is the number of senators and congresspeople who voted in favor of the Respect for Marriage Act last December. So substantially over a majority in both houses, 61 senators, 258 representatives, including over 30 Republicans. This act ratified in law the 2015 SCOTUS decision called Obergefell and Hodges, along with other decisions, the Windsor decision a few years before. It formally repealed the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act, which had banned federal and state reciprocal recognition of gay marriages. By the way, to show you how the numbers have changed, when DOMA was approved in 1996, it was approved with 342 votes in the House and 85 out of 100 votes in the Senate. And so in just that 35-year period, it's been quite a sea change. That's good news. Not just that the bill passed, but that it passed with so many votes. Here's another number, 491. This is the number of anti-LGBT bills that the ACLU is tracking in state legislatures just in the 2023 legislative session, 491. I noticed there are 0 in Illinois, but there are some in just about every other state. Everything from banning gender-affirming healthcare to the right to discriminate, to removing books from public school libraries, to the dangers of the drag show. So far, 72 of these bills have passed into law. Another 153 have been defeated, either in committee or on the floor, and over 260 are still being considered for the second half of the year. And the trend on this front is alarming. In 2018, the ACLU counted 42 such bills, 1/10 as many. In 2020, it was 77. Last year in 2022, it was 180. And this year, 491. Bad news. Another number, 71%. In 2022, when the Gallup survey asked people, do you think marriages between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by the law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriage? 71% of Americans said yes in 2022. In 1996, when DOMA was passed, that number was 26% approval. So from 26% to 71%, that's a big difference. And it's not just 71%, it's 49% of Republicans. It's 64% of those living in the South. It's 60% of those 65 and older. I will note that for those under age 30, it's 89% approval. And even better numbers show up for support on anti-discrimination protection in housing and employment and public accommodations. 80% of the national population support a ban on discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodation, including 2/3 of Republicans. Even in the states with the lowest support of these anti-discrimination measures, states like Arkansas, Mississippi, South Carolina, and West Virginia, even there, approximately two-thirds say what we say, which is what we think is on the right side of history and morality. This is good news. Another number, 19. 19 states that have passed laws banning gender-affirming healthcare, covering 30% of transgender youth between ages 13 and 18. Another 6 states are considering it, and some are considering banning the procedure through age 26. Why is this important? We have to realize that there is a dramatic difference in prevalence of drug use, in suicide rates, in just plain misery for people whose true gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth and who are condemned to live what to them is a lie. You hear a lot about a few transgender athletes. You don't hear much about the hundreds of families that are now considering leaving their homes and their jobs to save their children. I saw an article just this week that military families are having to ask to be relocated because their children are bullied or worse because of where they're stationed and about which they have no choice. This is definitely bad news. When Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977, homosexual behavior, as it was called then, had just been legalized in California the year before, in 1976. Does anyone happen to know the first state that decriminalized homosexual behavior? Illinois, in 1962. I'll also note, though, that that behavior was still on the books illegal in 14 states in 2003, when it was finally stricken from the books by the Supreme Court, Lawrence versus Texas. Now, Harvey Milk had served in the Navy for 4 years after graduating college, trained to be a teacher. But he left after 4 years in the Navy when people began questioning his sexuality. He taught public school in Long Island and then left that job. He worked as a stockbroker in New York City before moving to San Francisco's famous Castro Street in 1972, where he opened a camera store. I'll note that when he opened a camera store, he put his bar mitzvah picture on the wall. He was not religiously Jewish, and he wasn't actively a believer in the supernatural. He didn't want a religious service for his funeral, even though he got one. He was culturally Jewish, and actively so, and outwardly so. It was a part of who he was, and it taught him sympathy for other minorities and other suffering. His gay activism was a product also of his experience having been Jewish. He was a strong advocate for all minorities, as well as for gay rights. And in 1978, which is 45 years ago this year, he was assassinated along with Mayor George Moscone by a former member of that same Board of Supervisors. To give you an idea of how long ago this was, Their bodies were found by a fellow supervisor who was 45 years old named Dianne Feinstein when she was 45. So that was a long time ago. Now, Milk became famous even before his death for his fearless advocacy for gay and lesbian rights. And hearing those numbers, he might be cheered by all the progress that those groups have seen. But you might have noticed a pattern with those good news, bad news numbers that I chose. There's mostly positive progress for maybe the simple LGBT identity of being gay or lesbian, but being cisgender, being the same gender as the sex assigned at birth. And the major issues that we read about and we see all this legislation directed against, or most of the legislation directed against, are for the T in LGBT, for the transgender population. Now, it's not all sunshine for all things same sex. For example, that right to discriminate that all these people said they supported, there are plenty of laws being passed allowing religions to do exactly that, whether it's in wedding cakes and websites or foster care agencies who refuse to allow gay couples to use their services. By the way, many of them also refuse to allow Jewish straight couples to use their services because of that religious exemption they're trying to exploit. And even teachers at religious schools who are not teaching religious subjects. There was, I think, a girls lacrosse coach that was let go from a Catholic school because she happened to put a picture of her wife on her desk or let the students know that she had a partner of the same gender. They're not even, it's not like they're clergy that are breaking the rules. These are teachers who are just doing their job. But that religious exemption goes further and further these days. But why is it that we hear so much about the transgender population as a target? Why have they been targeted so much? Why is this the foreground of LGBTQ rights in 2023? Well, I have a few ideas. You might have some thoughts as well. The first is that in some ways, the fanatics are losing the culture war. Pat Robertson died this week. I know some people who were not sad at that result. I know some who might draw a lesson from it, because after all, Pat Robertson had no trouble drawing lessons from disasters. He would see a hurricane and say, oh, it must be because of acceptance of gay rights. He would see a flood in New Orleans and say, oh, it must be because of the Roe versus Wade decision. He had no trouble extrapolating from 9/11 to all kinds of sins of the country that he saw being punished. And so the fact that he has died, we might decide that maybe there's some cosmic justice there. He did make it to 93, though, so maybe, justice delayed is justice denied, they say. Maybe that applies in this case, too. But the point is that the world that Pat Robertson became active in, that we began to know him in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, they're losing. They won DOMA in 1996. They're losing with the Respect for Marriage Act. So they need an enemy. They need someone to rile up the troops, to get them animated. They need the person to persecute. Now, I do want to point out that this is a natural human phenomenon, to find the scapegoat, to look for the person who violates the norm, to cancel them, whether it's the witches in the 1600s or it's the violator of social media protocol these days. I mean, this happens. We do this. But this is playing out on people's lives and causing them tremendous pain and suffering. I think the transgender population makes an attractive target because it's a wedge issue. You can get people who aren't the fanatics riled up. Do you want adult men going into the same bathroom as your little girl? It's playing on those fears. Do you want your daughters to have their athletic scholarships stolen by a man pretending to be a woman? And it might even be dangerous to have those men playing with those girls. And you'll hear that language of men and girls. They're the same age. And if they're pre-puberty, they're the same size. I mean, there are plenty of stories of 8-year-old boys getting beaten up by 8-year-old girls. And then you also hear that terrible label, groomer. The assumption that anybody who is gay is going to groom children. Sometimes Harvey Milk would play with that. He would say, I'm here to recruit you for my campaign. But that's the accusation that goes back a long time. And for a long time, you had as much chance of that as you did of getting assaulted by a priest or by other figures. In fact, as those numbers come out, we begin to wonder which was more dangerous. But the point is that there's no more prevalence of child abuse among the gay population as there is among the straight population. If anything, in an era of closeting and persecution, the last thing you would want to do is expose yourself to the risk of being exposed. But it's a wedge issue. It's something you can rile people up, get them animated and angry and willing to vote for your side, because the other side is evil. We live in an era today where it's not just black and white. There are lots of shades of gray. Maybe gender is a spectrum, and there are people who are neither A nor B, but somewhere in the non-binary world, or people who have moved from one side to the other, or who live with a foot in both places. That's hard for some people to handle. They want this or that. The ambiguities of a postmodern, post-liberation experience are challenging for them. They want clear gender roles, and ever since feminism, that's all been messed up. Because women are graduating from college at greater rates than men. In some professions, they're earning more than men. In some professions, they're earning less than men. But the point is that they're not fitting into the box that people imagine they should fit in, or they used to fit in when they didn't have a choice. So a generation ago, 2 generations ago by now, that those clear lines begin to change, and some people can't handle the gray. And this idea of drawing lines goes back to Leviticus. I mentioned the not plowing the field with 2 different kinds of animals. There's rules there about women wearing men's clothing, and men are not allowed to wear women's clothing. There's foods you're allowed and foods that you're not allowed. There's people you're allowed to marry and people you're not allowed to marry. There's in and out, there's us and them. There's right and wrong, and a big black line in the middle. That's the old-fashioned world. We live in a world of making choices, accepting diversity, and allowing there to be somewhere not A or B, but something else. I think another reason why the transgender population has been targeted is that there is a phenomenon I see as a sexualization of the LGBTQ population. There's this tremendously insensitive compulsion to ask transgender people about their genitals. I don't ask anyone about their genitals. I do baby namings. I don't ask about the it is not part of civilized conversation with people you don't know very, very well. Even people you know very well, you may not want to talk about. And yet people assume that that's part of the conversation, because there's something about seeing that person, and the identity strikes the uninitiated, the uneducated, the simple as, well, I have to think about the sex. How does that work? How do you do that? There's an assumption that mentioning a same-sex partnership is pornography. Because of course, when you mention 2 women that love each other, well, okay, now I'm thinking of everything. But you don't do that with a straight couple. Maybe you do. But it doesn't have to affect the storybooks you read. It doesn't affect the conversations in a class. The picture of a spouse on a desk is not a sexual phenomenon. But all too often, with lesbians and gay male couples and the transgender and bisexuals as well, it becomes about sex. And people assume it's pornography, it's inappropriate for children, and so it has to all go. But it doesn't, because people are people. And the last one, and this is the hardest to define, I guess you could just call it the ick factor. The ick factor is, just makes me feel weird. Just makes me feel weird to see that person like that, to see that couple like that. I feel uncomfortable, and my discomfort means they have to not be there. My ick factor supersedes their right to be present to be visible, to be themselves. Now, that used to apply to gay men, to lesbian couples. You know, think about the earthquake of seeing two women kiss on television. It's an earthquake in our lifetime. It's the earthquake that a generation ago was a black and a white person kissing on television, which had its ick factor back then. But the problem with the ick factor is that it's not susceptible to rational argument because people feel that way. But the question is, do your feelings supersede my freedom, my rights, my equality? What would be justice to me? And what used to apply to gay and lesbian couples, that ick factor, now is applied with double force on the transgender population, because that whole phenomenon, whether it's the visual or the contemplation of the surgery, strikes people as disturbing to their sense of equilibrium. That's why there's so much obsession with gender-affirming healthcare and with the surgery. They keep talking about the surgery. And more often than not, it's the hormones that are actually what's providing the sense of well-being and the diminution of what's called bodily dysphoria, the sense that you're in the wrong body. They use phrases in their legislation like stopping child mutilation. But what can we do? We're not going to not win the culture war. We're not going back. And we don't have to accommodate everyone's ick factor, after all. It's their problem, not our problem. One of my favorite scenes in a movie of Jewish feminism called A Price Above Rubies, where the feminist heroine of the movie goes back to visit the Rebbitzin, the dead rabbi's wife, and the bouncer at the door says to her, you know, for some reason she'll see you, but for God's sake, make yourself look decent by covering your hair. And she says to the man, who's a head and a half taller than she is, you can look at your shoes or you can look at the ceiling, but it's not my problem. How I look is your problem, not my problem. Your problem with me is your problem. So we're going to be firm and assert our rights. But there are things that we can do. We can stay informed. We can learn about experiences that are beyond our own. If we are not transgender, we can meet people who are. If we have not heard these stories, we can listen for them and look out for them. We can support those people we do know who are targeted in any range of that LGBTQ plus spectrum. We can donate to causes that support this population, from the Trevor Project to help LGBTQ youth, to the Human Rights Campaign, and many other options for advocacy and support. We can certainly vote for parties and for people who support those human rights. There's a meaningful moment in the movie Milk about Harvey Milk's life. I have no idea if it's true or not. It could be dramatic license. But he gives a very meaningful speech on the meaning of coming out, what it means to come out to oneself, as we saw in that video of that song, of stories of people learning to accept who they really are. There's coming out to a relative, there's coming out to friends, there's coming out to congregants in a community. And then, of course, we want to support people as human beings, because being true to yourself is a human and humanist value. It doesn't matter where you land on the letter spectrum. I want to end with a good news story. You may know that the first Pride parade was actually a Pride riot. It was a reaction to a raid on the Stonewall Inn in 1969 in New York City. As one example of the spirit of the moment, after the police raid, people were milling around in the streets, and there was a line of police officers who were getting ready to attack those gay men, mostly, who were being arrested for this bar. And the gay men, in response, led by a number of drag queens, it should be said, started a can-can line as their rebuttal to the police. And that's the joy of that moment, is that we respond to violence with the can-can. And the next year, in 1970, was the first Pride March on the anniversary of that. That was in June of 1970. Well, in June of 2023, there are two Pride marches in Chicago that are of a significant scale. The main one is in the city, as it's always been, in the neighborhoods that are historically the gay neighborhoods of the city. But in recent years, a new one started in the suburbs. And it was run actually as part of a passion project started by I think a middle schooler at the time, Carolyn Pinto, I think her name is, or the family name is Pinto. And so she started this Buffalo Grove Pride Parade. Obviously, it had hard times during the pandemic. It was a little more challenging. But this year, we had it at full scale. And Cole Hadash walked in the Buffalo Grove Pride Parade. We were by far not the most interesting group traveling through. There were music and dancing and a drum line, and we were right behind these twirlers. It was I forget what the name of it was. It was like Chicago Pride. I forget what you call those groups, but it was a bunch of twirlers throwing banners up in the air, and we're handing out pens. But the pens had our name on it in rainbow colors, and we were in different colored shirts, and it was okay. But I have to say, we got more out of seeing the parade than they got out of us giving out the pens, because there were thousands of people cheering and happy and joyful in rainbow clothes saying Happy Pride. And it was very meaningful for us to be able to offer our support, to show that this is our community too, and that we're here for you. It may be the worst of times at times, but once in a while, you get the feeling that it could also be the best of times.